chapter 8. I was going to come back this week and go back through the four beasts in chapter 7, and we will do that maybe next time. There's a lot there, and I really just couldn't get to study as much as I wanted to this week on it. It's going to be a lot of going back and forth between Daniel and Revelation and some other places, and so I want to do it right or the best we can, and so we'll come back to that hopefully next time. And like I think I mentioned last time that it may even take 2 weeks to study what I want to look at through that. Now, if you remember last time in chapter 7, Daniel goes from Darius, his reign, to Belshazzar. He goes back in time, in other words. So Belshazzar was before Darius. Darius is the Medes and Persians' first king. Belshazzar was the last king of Babylon. He was Nebuchadnezzar's son. And he ruled for a very short time before he was overthrown. The chapter 7 starts off in the first year of Belshazzar. Chapter 8 starts off in the third year of Belshazzar. So 2 years have passed now, and we're going to look at the vision of the ram, the goat, and the horn tonight. We'll try to get through the whole chapter. It's it looks long, but it's really not that much. There is a lot to study there, but I mean, just not a lot of time to spend on it. So, Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. So this is after the last vision he had, basically, that he had in the first year. And I saw in a vision, and it came to pass, when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river of Uli. And so if you remember Shushan, Nebuchadnezzar had what we would call a summer palace there. Summer or winter palace, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't his main palace where he stayed in Babylon. It was in another country, one of the provinces that he had conquered. And if you look it up on terms of today, it was in what is now Iran, close to where the river Euphrates cuts through Iran. It was close to there. And he says in the province of Elam. And he names the river here Ulai. It's let me go back and look at something right quick. I might clarify this. Because some of these names are all throughout Scripture, through the Old Testament in particular. And if you go back, even as far back as Noah and his descendants, you see where some of these names come from. Some of the names of these cities, some of the names of these countries, even some of the names of the rivers were named after the sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of Noah. Elam, the land of Elam, he talks about. Elam was the one of the sons of Shem, Noah's son. So if you go, and you can find that in Genesis 10:22, if you want to look at that later. But that's where the province of Elam gets its name from. So this would have been where the people of Elam, his descendants, settled. And in this vision, I don't know, I'm not fully, and maybe I need to look at this deeper, but it says, and I saw in a vision, and it came to pass when I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace. In other words, it appears to me that he was at the palace in Shushan. And remember, Daniel by this time is overseeing a lot of the kingdom for the king. And so possibly he has traveled there even with the king. We don't know for sure, but he would have been one of the king's closest confidants. And so it's very possible that he had traveled there with the king to be with him during a time of relaxation, if nothing else, a vacation as we would call it, or holiday. But while he's there, he has this troubling dream, or troubling vision. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw, and behold, there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will and became great. And some say that this is a vision or a representation of Darius, the first king of the Medes and Persians. And he says, and so talking about the 2 horns here, his the 2 horns that he talks about were high. The Mede and Persian empires. The Mede and Persians came together into one empire under Darius. So you have one head, which is the king of the empire, and you have the 2 horns, which are the 2 different empires that came together. It was a marriage of 2 empires, and it was a mutual thing. And so you have here the example of that. And he says, the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. So he's coming from the east. And the Medes and the Persians, that part of the empire came from Iran. What we know as Iran today. Remember, Iran is the same, or practically the same area as old Persia. And so the Medes and the Persians, Darius would have come from the east, pushing towards the west and going northward and southward. And there's even mention of the Medes and the Persians when it's, I don't know, when I looked at John Gill's, and I should have looked at a map, I guess, when I was looking at it, but he names all the countries that the Medes and the Persians took into their empire. A lot of them are not even there anymore. They're names of nations that are not there anymore. And of course, and especially since, if you think back in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, the Soviet Union conquered what they called the Iron Curtain, the nations around them, and changed names of places and absorbed nations into other nations and that kind of thing. Places changed names. And then with the fall of the Soviet Union, some of those places even broke up and became different names than what they were before. So it's kind of hard to explain where all this is, but if you think about around the Caspian Sea and then as you go westward, even as far as the Grecian islands, and then southward, he even went as far south as Egypt and parts of Ethiopia. And some say it even when this southward also includes parts of India. Now that's more eastward than south, but it appears as though the Medes and the Persians did take in a lot of that territory. And he says, and became great. He had become very great in power. And we mention all this, and you think, well, how do we know all this? Well, we'll see later in this chapter, the Lord, when he explains all this, when his angel comes and explains all this to Daniel, he talks about all this stuff. And it's pretty amazing how we don't see in detail, and especially name calling detail like this with visions for the most part in the scripture. Sometimes we do, but not as often, not very often, and this is one of the exceptions here. So we'll get to that in a moment. And in verse 5, and as I was considering, in other words, as I was thinking on these things and watching and paying attention, behold, an he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. It always boggles my mind how people get this little horn on the he-goat here mixed up with the little horn mentioned in the last chapter. I'm not going to get into that this week. We'll look at that when we get to that into more depth in chapter 7. But it's not the same. This is one has already, as far as our time is concerned, this has already happened. The one in the last chapter is yet to come, if I'm understanding correctly. And so, verse 6, and he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler, which is another word for fury, against him, and smote the ram, and brake his two horns. And there was no power in the ram to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. The Grecian Empire under Alexander the Great. If you remember the stories, and we've talked some about that. He says, behold, and he-goat came from the west, which would have been from Greece, came from the west. He touched not the ground, it says. How is that possible? Because he moved with speed, with lightning like speed. It was though they never stopped. They just kept going. It's like they were flying. They were moving so fast it appeared to be flying into battle, and touched not the ground, it says. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. And some say that this is the example of Alexander the Great, the horn, and the goat being the Grecian Empire. He came to the ram that had two horns, and basically just destroyed the ram. It says, which I had seen stand by the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. He just ran into him head on. And you think, oh, a goat and a ram, you think the ram would win. He's larger. And yes, the Medes and the Persians empire was much larger than the Greece empire in the beginning. When Alexander the Great came to power, they were just a little nation, a little city-state, mostly. But they become very powerful. They moved with speed and overthrew the ram. He smote the ram, brake his two horns. In other words, he crushed the Medes and the Persians, and then stamped on them, it says. Cast them down to the ground and stamped on them. In other words, he totally defeated them, just totally destroyed the Medes and the Persians' empire. And there was none that could stop him. None that could stop Alexander. Alexander took over all of the Medes and Persian empire plus some. And he says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken. When Alexander the Great was at it, when the Grecian Empire was at its strongest, at its peak, Alexander died. Died a very young man. He was in the prime of life. He died. And he says the great horn was broken, and after it came up four notable ones toward the four winds of heaven. There were four of his four top generals fought for control of the empire after Alexander died. And that's what he's talking about here. And we've talked about that when we talked about, remember, Nebuchadnezzar's the vision he had of the statue. We talked about that then. And he says, and out of one of them came forth a little horn, which waxed exceeding great, toward the south, and toward the east, and toward the pleasant land. To the south and to the east. So if you go back and study history, you see where the greatest of these came out of Syria. These four generals picked and choose the areas they wanted. That was kind of where they set up their heads of state, basically. They set up their where they would rule from. And this one, he says, then came forth a little horn. And here's another place. This little horn is mentioned. Not the same that we've seen before. And you notice it says little horn. And remember, Alexander is referred to here as the great horn. There's a difference. This man was never as strong as Alexander was. He waxed exceeding great toward the south and toward the east and toward the pleasant land. Some say that the pleasant land refers to the promised land, Israel, because he would have controlled that part of the world also. The Fertile Crescent would have been under his control. So he waxed exceeding great. He became very powerful, not as powerful as Alexander, but very powerful. He ruled from and I can't pronounce the man's name, but he ruled from Antioch, which was in Syria, if I'm understanding correctly. And so he came up. He persecuted the Jews, God's people, greatly in his day. Killed many. Legend has it that he went to Jerusalem. The temple had been rebuilt. If you remember the story in the scripture, when Nehemiah rebuilt the city, they also rebuilt the temple and began to worship there again. When this man came along, he defiled the temple that was there, and they say that he even had a statue or an altar or something of that sort of the god Jupiter, the Greek god. Is it Jupiter or Zeus? That is the Greek head god. I can't remember. I get those two mixed up.
Zeus would have been the head god, I think.
Zeus was the Greek head god. Jupiter was Roman.
Oh, okay, all right.
So he put a statue of him there in the temple of God, and basically to make fun of the God of the Jews. And he tormented the Jews greatly in his day. In verse 11, yea, he magnified himself, even to the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. You see what he's talking about here? He's talking about the daily sacrifice was taken away. He's talking about the Jews at the temple. He took away all their sacrifices. He took away part of their persecution under him was he took away everything that they were doing religiously, and tried to substitute it with the worship of a false god. And an host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So what he did took hold. At least for a time, it was the religion of the day, if you will. And they cast down the truth, he says. And it practiced and it prospered. What practiced and prospered? The false religion that he was involved in. Verse 13, that I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot? So this saint is asking, how long will this last? How long will this persecution last? And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So he tells exactly how long it's going to take. And I should have wrote it down, but it's like 6 years, and I can't remember how many months, and 18 days, I think. The Lord is going to cause this to happen at the temple, but when it's over, the temple's going to be cleansed again. And then next we see an angel coming and tell Daniel the explanation of this vision. Because remember, we've talked about all this just now, but Daniel has no clue what they're talking about, what this vision is about. So God sends an angel to explain things to him. Verse 15, and it came to pass when even I, Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Ulai, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. God spoke. He says the voice of a man, but it was God speaking to him. And he calls on Gabriel, the archangel Gabriel, one of the angels Gabriel, to help Daniel understand this vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid, and fell upon my face. But he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. Now notice, Daniel falls on his face before this angel, but he does not worship the angel. There's other times in Scripture where men would fall before an angel and begin to worship the angel, thinking that it was God, or because he was an angel or a holy being, that he deserved reverence. And in those instances, the angel always told the man, stand up, don't worship me. This angel Gabriel doesn't do this here because Daniel does not worship the angel here. He bows, he falls on his face before him, but it's mostly because he's afraid. If you notice, he says, I was afraid and fell upon my face. So it's not because he's falling on his face to worship him. So don't misunderstand that. And he says, but he said unto me, Understand, O son of man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. So at the end of the 2,300 days, at the end of that time period, that's when this vision takes place. That's when the vision will end. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep on my face toward the ground. But he touched me and set me upright. And he said, Behold, I will make thee know what shall be in the last end of the indignation, for at the time appointed the end shall be. Now understand, he's not talking about the end of days here. He's not talking about the end times, the end of the tribulation, or the end of times. This is not that far ahead. This is talking about the end of this time of persecution from the emperor or king, whatever he was, from Syria, who was persecuting the Jews. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. So here we go. The angel is going to explain to him and call by name who these people are, or at least where they're from. And so we know by what we've already studied that this is true, or we know that by this, compare it with what we've already studied, that this is true. The ram which thou sawest having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. Darius and Cyrus were the two kings from Persia, Media and Persia. The rough goat is the king of Grecia, which was Alexander. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who was the first king? Alexander the Great. Now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand out of the nation, but not in his power. So there were the 4 generals who appointed themselves kings, broke up the kingdom into four separate kingdoms, but they didn't have the power that Alexander the Great had. They were very weak compared to what he was. And in the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to the full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. So one of these men, one of these four, is going to be a lot worse than the other three. He's going to be more wicked and more evil than they are. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice, and shall destroy the mighty and the holy people. Who are the mighty and holy people? The people of Israel. The people who have, after the captivity, have gone back to Jerusalem. And through his policy also he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace shall destroy many. He's going to, where he says he shall cause craft to prosper in his hand. He's talking about witchcraft. He's talking about lies and deception and magic and those things. And then he says, and he shall magnify himself in his heart. He's going to be self-centered. He's not going to be a godly man at all. And he don't care about the people. All he cares about is himself. And by peace shall destroy many. He's going to be crying peace, calling for peace. But his way of peace is to destroy his own subjects. If you remember, Alexander the Great, in his day, even as powerful as he was well thought of. His subjects loved him for the most part. After they got kind of used to him, he was brutal when it came to battle. But once he conquered a land, he cared about his subjects. This man's not going to be that way. And he says, and by peace shall destroy many. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. Who is this? You notice the first word prince is capitalized. This is the Lord himself. This is God. Why? Well, we mentioned earlier that he's going to come up against the temple. He's going to put the statue of a false god, his high god, in the temple, a slap in the face of the true God. And he says, but he shall be broken without hand. God's going to take care of him. And the vision of the evening and the morning, which was told, is true. Wherefore shut thou up the vision, for it shall be for many days. So it's not going to happen for a while. It's going to last a long time, but it's not going to be for a little while. He tells Daniel, shut up the vision. Don't let people understand it. Don't and like we've said before, much of what we read in Daniel was not understood until Revelation was written. In this case, he tells Daniel not to let the people read this part. Shut it up. Don't let them know about it. Things are going to play out, and they'll begin to see it later. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. Afterward I rose up and did the king's business, and I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. Daniel, this has him so distraught, because this is going to affect his people. This is going to affect the people of God. And this vision, this great vision that he sees, is not good. It's a horrible vision. A lot of death and destruction and persecution is going to take place in the future. And the angel Gabriel has explained all this to him. And kind of to get his mind off of things, he gets up and goes about the king's business, goes about his job. And he says, I was astonished at the vision, but none understood it. So he did mention it to others, but they didn't understand it. None of them understood it. Did he tell them the explanation of the vision that Gabriel? I don't believe he did, because Gabriel told him to shut up the vision. In other words, don't tell them the meaning of it. He told them the vision, but none of them understood what was going to happen. They had no clue as to what was going to happen. So, next, in chapter 9, he goes back to Darius. And so, like I said, I hope, Lord willing, next time we'll go back to chapter 7. There's some things in chapter 7 that we're going to, as far as the 4 beasts are concerned, we're going to go back and forth between Revelation and what we've studied already in Revelation and compare notes. And along with some other things we'll look at. So be in prayer about that we get a blessing out of that. So we'll stop there for tonight.